My name is Hendrik Lloyd, and I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Business and Economic Sciences here at Nelson Mandela University. It is my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you a new concept within our faculty and a new initiative called Best Talk. The whole objective and purpose of Best Talk is to highlight the expertise within the faculty and to also share this expertise with a wider audience across our various platforms that we stream the Best Talk series. Furthermore, the further objective is to attract postgraduate students to our faculty through marketing these expertise and pockets of excellence to our prospective students, and to encourage them also to engage with us on these topics and activities. This is a new initiative in our faculty, and it will be presented on a monthly basis. The presentation will normally be per department or academic unit or school within the faculty. And of course, it is my pleasure and privilege today also to introduce our first speaker in the Best Talk series, namely Mr. Ewain Leroux from our Accounting Sciences Department. And Mr. Leroux is of course also stationed at our George campus. And the topic of his presentation today will be From Compliance to Behavior: What New Governance and Reporting Frameworks Mean for Municipal Practice in South Africa. Of course, a very topical theme to start off with, seeing that infrastructure and service delivery is a main driver of economic activity and prosperity in our local municipalities, in our regional economies, and of course wider afield in our national economy. We wish Mr. Leroux every best with the talk, and we are looking forward to share our views afterwards also with him. I thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for granting me the opportunity to share this BS talk with you, and for taking the time to listen today. And then I hope also that this talk will open the door for future discussions on this specific topic, both today and in the future. Just by way of introduction, my name is Ewain Leroux. I'm a qualified chartered accountant and a lecturer in the School of Accounting at Mandela University on George campus. My research interest is focused mainly on sustainability reporting, public sector reporting and governance. In particular, I try to look at how these frameworks influence the management of public institutions. In today's talk, I'll be discussing a shift which is becoming increasingly visible in the South African public sector, where there's a move away from simply complying with rules towards a focus on behavior and leadership within public sector institutions. So in simple terms, my talk is focusing on why municipalities in particular still struggle even when the rules and frameworks are already in place, and how newer governance and reporting frameworks are beginning to encourage more proactive leadership, better decision-making, and strong accountability. So just before I start, let me start with a few events that many of us may have seen in the news over the last few months or so. If we can recall, for instance, in the Western Cape, there was severe damage or infrastructure damage in several towns in the Garden Route due to wildfires. In the Eastern Cape, in KZN, where flooding have destroyed the roads, bridges, and municipal infrastructure. And currently elsewhere in the country, we see how water shortages and electricity or power outages have exposed weaknesses in the municipalities' water systems as well as electricity distribution systems. So when these events appear in the news, they are often described either as natural disasters or infrastructure failures. But when we look more closely, they often reveal something more deeper about how institutions function. And if you just think back, that infrastructure systems rarely fail overnight. So in many cases, the warning signs appear long before the crisis. It is either through a course of delayed maintenance, weak planning, or risk that were known but not addressed early enough. So in that sense, these events are not only environmental or technical problems, but they are also governance issues. And that raises an important question. South Africa has already extensive governance frameworks for municipalities. If we think about legislation such as the MFMA, which governs the financial management of municipalities, governance frameworks such as the King Code, and then also oversight from institutions such as the Auditor General and so forth. So on paper, these systems appear strong. However, year after year, the Auditor General in the annual reports or annual MFMA reports continue to highlight weaknesses across many municipalities. So then the question becomes that if the rules and the frameworks already exist, why do these type of problems keep on persisting? And that is basically the question that sits at the center of this talk today. So in order for one to answer this question, one place we can look for answers is in the AG's MFMA reports. So when we look or we analyze those reports from the AG over the last number of years, let's say, for example, from 2020 up until the most recent one, which was 2024, then you will see something interesting begin to appear. So the earlier reports from 2020 and backwards, they would focus mainly on compliance. So they would ask questions such as whether procurement rules were followed, financial statements were prepared correctly or in line with the financial reporting framework, or whether compliance or legislation were complied with. But the more recent reports, so for example, from 2021 to 2024 and so forth, they focus on something deeper. So they focus on behavior. So the reports repeatedly emphasize that municipal failures persist, not because frameworks are absent, but because leadership, oversight, and admin systems within these institutions do not function consistently in practice. So we'll see repeat findings in these reports or across these reports have the same root causes and which appears on a yearly basis, and they highlight issues such as weak leadership, weak internal controls, limited consequence management, and so forth. In other words, the problem is not simply technical, right? It is behavioral. And this behavior often shows up in a very specific pattern. Many municipalities remain stuck in a cycle of reacting to problems rather than preventing them. And all problems are only, or this manifests or shows or indicates in the fact that problems are addressed only after they are identified during the audit process. Or you, for instance, see during the audit that financial statements require major corrections. Or another example is investigations into irregular expenditure often occur only after the auditors have highlighted or raised concern about them. And then for some municipalities, you always see these repeat type of findings a year. It's the same findings that occur year after year after year. And in other words, the system often fixes these problems after they occur rather than preventing them in the first place. And we can see this reactive pattern very clearly if we look at one simple practical example, for instance, or if we take just infrastructure maintenance. So municipalities manage large infrastructure systems such as water networks, roads, electricity distribution systems, and so forth. And all of these infrastructure systems, they depend on regular maintenance. But here's a simple question. So how many municipalities can clearly tell us how much they actually spend on preventative maintenance versus how much they spend on corrective maintenance? And in many cases, although that information should be readily available at all times, it is not available. And that itself tells us something important. that if the system were truly proactive, municipalities would track this information carefully. They would know whether they are investing in preventing failures, which is sometimes cheaper, rather than simply fixing them afterwards. And this example illustrates then a broader pattern that too often institutions respond to problems only once they have occurred. But this is precisely the pattern that the AG is trying to change. So you will also then see in the more recent years, in the reports that the AG has released, there has been an increased emphasis on the importance of behavioral change in municipal leadership. So rather than focusing solely on whether the rules were followed, the reports now place greater emphasis on leadership behavior, preventative controls, and institutions' ability to anticipate and to manage risk. And there are early signs that this approach by the AG may be actually influencing behavior. So you'll see in some municipalities, practices are actually starting to improve. But then also in the AG's material irregularity process, that has also led to investigations being undertaken by several municipalities. It has led to the cancellation of problematic contracts, or in some cases, even the recovery of funds. However, this progress is uneven. But these developments does suggest that a shift towards strong accountability and preventative action may be taking place at the moment amongst these public sector institutions. And then to explain this shift more clearly, the AG often refers to a spectrum of behavior. So you'll find at the lowest end of the spectrum are behaviors that they believe actually harm institutions, and this would include actions or activities such as ignoring controls, tolerating irregular expenditure, or even failing to respond to audit findings. And then as you move further along the spectrum, you will find institutions who comply with the rules, but they do little beyond the minimum, and they only respond when problems arise, and very rarely they would try to prevent those problems from arising in the first place. As you move even further along the spectrum, you will find others that take a more active approach, They strengthen controls, monitor risk, and then address issues early. And then at the most positive end of the spectrum, there are institutions who are characterized by ethical leadership, strong accountability, and proactive management. So improving municipal performance ultimately means moving institutions towards the more positive or proactive end of the spectrum, because the focus is no longer only whether municipality achieved the clean audit outcome. For example, two municipalities may both comply with financial reporting requirements, and they both may receive clean audit outcomes, yet the way they are managed can look very different in practice. One may simply be meeting the minimum targets, whereas another may be strengthening their systems, anticipating risk, and improving services. So the questions that we should be asking is starting to change. So instead of us focusing or asking whether a municipality received a clean audit, we start asking whether a municipality caused harm, or has the municipality simply complied with the basics, or is the municipality or institution improving the lives of the citizens or people that they serve. And that shift in the type of questions being asked reflect a broader move from compliance to behavior. Then furthermore, frameworks are also increasingly starting to recognize this challenge. So in South Africa, the most influential governance framework is the King Code. And in the recently released King 5 code builds on the King 4 version, which is refining and strengthening many of the leadership and oversight principles that were included in King 4. King 4 also included sector supplements that explain how its principles apply to different sectors, including one specifically for municipalities. However, when we look at what actually happens in many municipalities, there is limited evidence that the King Code is widely applied in practice, though some municipalities may have tried to apply the principles to strengthen the leadership and oversight. But even in this limited uptake, this limited uptake may be meaningful because it may be indicating progress. If we keep in mind that the King Code is not legislation, so municipalities are not required to implement it. So when a municipality does try to apply its principles, it can be seen as a small but important sign of behavioral change, which indicates a willingness to move beyond simply complying with legislation and move towards broader principles of responsible leadership and accountability. Then, at the same time, municipal management also remains largely compliance driven, and the King Code is then often treated as a guidance rather than as something municipalities actively embed in their operations. One example, and then this idea of moving beyond compliance towards better behavior and decision making is then also emerging in the newer type of reporting frameworks. So one example of this is the newly released SRS-1 by the IPSAS-B. It is the Sustainability Reporting Standard 1, and it focused on climate-related disclosures. It was issued in January 2026 and will be effective from 2028. And this SRS-1 requires organizations to disclose how climate risk influence leadership, strategy, and decision-making. So, and then at present, although it does focus primarily on the environmental pillar of sustainability, the future reporting developments will likely expand it to include broader social and governance dimensions, but we'll wait to see. But for municipalities, this type of reporting reflects an important behavioral shift because it moves them away from simply reporting on past events and moves them towards a more careful consideration of future risk, not in the sense that they will be required to predict disasters, but in anticipating risk and ensuring that the systems are in place when they actually occur. Environmental risk increasingly affect municipal systems. So if you think wildfires damage infrastructure, floods destroy roads and bridges, water and electricity shortages, they disrupt the everyday life of citizens. And these events show why institutions need to anticipate risk and be prepared rather than only responding after the crisis occur. The examples that I've mentioned remind us that how municipalities are run is not an abstract concept. It shapes whether infrastructure is maintained, services continue to function, and whether municipalities can respond when the problems arise. And this shift is the shift that we are starting to see. It may still be subtle, but it is becoming noticeable. Increasingly, the conversation is moving beyond simply compliance or simple compliance, and is moving towards leadership behavior, proactive decision-making, and strong institutional systems. Then at the same time, this more forward-looking approach also brings its own challenges. If we keep in mind that the public sector remains highly compliance-driven and rule-based, and that sometimes make innovation, or can sometimes make innovation difficult. Too much emphasis on compliance can discourage new ways of solving problems, but too much flexibility can then, on the other hand, weaken accountability and financial discipline. So the real challenge becomes finding the right balance between the two. However, there is a discussion for another day. And why this matters is because municipalities play a central role in local development. When planning is sound and your infrastructure is reliable, communities and local economies can function. This is especially important in the rural areas where the municipality is often the main public institution supporting local economic activity and basic services. So the real issue is no longer whether municipalities comply with the rules. It is whether they build systems, leadership practices, and have the foresight needed to support communities over the long term. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you very much for your time in joining our first BES talk. And I hope the ideas shared here open the door for further discussions on this topic. And I would welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation going forward. Thank you very much.